To remember, to consider, and to imitate, I want to lift verses from Paul's farewell address to the Ephesian elders that is recorded in Acts chapter 20. He says in verse 18, "You know how I lived the whole time I was with you." In verse 19, he says, "I served the Lord with great humility and with tears, although I was severely tested." And in verse 20, he says, "You know that I have not hesitated to preach anything that would be helpful to you." The text that I have read reflects the 5 essential qualities in a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ that we are to remember, that we are to consider, and that we are to imitate. These qualities are integrity, humility, passion, courage, and obedience. First, integrity. He says, "You know how I lived the whole time I was with you." The Apostle Paul had no missing gaps in his life, no time outs for seasons of sin or laziness or self-indulgence. He was on duty the whole time, not a fair weather worker. In life and ministry, there must be the presence of authenticity and the lack of artificiality. May there be no separation between our person and our persona, the person that we actually are versus the image that we project. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus warns against succumbing to the danger of measuring leadership by deeds rather than character. He says to people who come to him stating that they have cast out demons and preached in his name and done mighty works, "Depart from me, you workers of anomia," lawlessness. Who are these persons who come at the end of the age? It's one of the most frightful verses in the Bible. They are Pentecostal preachers. Why do I say that? Because non-Pentecostal preachers, by and large, are not casting out demons and doing mighty works and miracles. These are Pentecostals. Why does Jesus say what he says? Because they thought what they did would accredit them to the Lord rather than who they were. They didn't understand that your person and your persona have to be the same. In the years that I've had the privilege of being pastor and in leadership, I always ask this question when I'm seeking to hire key personnel or any personnel that I'm involved with. And it's this question: is this the kind of person I would like others to become like? Who you are is more important than what you do. And Paul says, "You know how I lived the whole time," not part-time, the whole time I was with you. One of our former ministers in this network said a poem that I don't know who the author is, but I picked it up from one of his messages. He said, "I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I'd rather one would walk with me than merely tell the way. The eye's a better pupil and more willing than the ear. Fine counsel is confusing, but example's always clear. The best of all the preachers are the men who live their creeds, for to see God put in action is what everybody needs. I soon can learn to do it if you let me see it done. I can watch your hands in action. Your tongue too fast may run. The lectures you deliver may be very wise and true, but I'd rather get my lessons by observing what you do. I may not understand the high advice you give, but there's no misunderstanding how you act and how you live. Be consistent in your life. Be committed to doing the right thing, to make the right choices, whether convenient or not. Integrity. The second word that the Apostle Paul uses to describe his ministry is humility. He says, "I serve the Lord with great humility." The Apostle's phrase here is a reflection of what he said in Romans chapter 12, verse 3. "Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you." We're not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought, nor should we think of ourselves more lower than we ought. There is much today that is written on leadership. We must be very careful that we retain Jesus' model of leadership, a leadership that is reflected also in the life of Paul and any person whom God has greatly used. Jesus said, "I am among you as one who serves." Today, many ministries and ministers are evaluated by others for their successes, and we live in an era of accomplishment and vision and purpose. These are very large words, but there is a larger word that brings humility to our hearts and our lives, and it is the word love. Love for the Lord and love for his people. This is what Jesus is concerned with in his final interview with Simon Peter before Jesus ascends to heaven. He asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" He wants to make sure that Peter's love is there before he gives Peter a responsibility to do anything in the kingdom. We prove then our love for Jesus by taking care of his people. So Jesus says, "Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep." Notice they are my sheep. That is, they are Jesus' sheep. They are not my sheep. It is not my church. It is not my Assemblies of God. It is not my Sunday school class. It is not my youth group. It is not my children's ministry. It is not my chaplaincy. It is Jesus. I am simply a trustee of his work. He owns it all. It is a tragedy, and I've seen enough of this, that my spirit just is exorcised within when I see pastoral leadership that is so driven by vision and purpose that the love for people has been crowded out. It's like people are a vehicle to be used to achieve my ends and my noble goals. And the goals may be noble and the vision may be right, but if we have to run over God's people to do it, if we have to scatter the flock to do it, what good is it when we stand before the Lord? He is going to be concerned about our love. He's going to be concerned about our love for him and our love for people. And part of the humility of being a minister of the gospel is simply being a good shepherd that does not scatter the sheep of God. The church is not a corporation. It is a flock. And the flock needs a shepherd, not a CEO. The shepherd cares for the weak and the young and the wounded. Jesus spoke of himself as the good shepherd who knows his flock and cares for them to the extent that he lays down his life for them, whereas the thief only comes to steal and kill and destroy. Jesus says, "I've come that they might have life and have it more abundantly." The welfare of others in our care is not always the motivation of people in positions of leadership. Exploitation of the weak by the powerful is an ancient wrong and a modern blight. Ezekiel talks about this in chapter 34 when he addressed the rulers of ancient Israel and accused them of being bad shepherds. He said, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to the shepherds of Israel who only take care of themselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak or healed the sick or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally, so they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them." Jesus reiterated, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep." God, deliver us from caring nothing for the sheep that the Lord has put into our hands. I realize that we have some cantankerous sheep. Often their cantankerousness results from hurt and deep need in their own life, and they're just lashing out. My task as an under-shepherd to Jesus Christ is not just to take care of and love the people who say nice things to me or to you, but to care for the whole flock of God. We are gatherers, not scatters. We are uniters and not dividers. And a third phrase that leaps out at me from this passage in Acts 20 is passion. Paul says, "I serve the Lord with humility and with tears." We must always have a passion for people. Being a minister of the gospel helps us to have opportunities to love people, to carry their sorrows, to be with them in times of joy and tragedy, illness and need. I always marvel at the shortest verse in the Bible and remember how I abused it as a kid growing up in Sunday school. The teacher would say among the 4th or 5th graders, now we're going to see how many of you know how many verses, and we're going to keep quoting verses until we have exhausted all of the knowledge of the students in the Sunday school. And so we would try to remember all the verses that we had memorized. My hand was always first up in the air because I wanted to get it out. Jesus wept, John 11:35. Then when I was old enough to understand and read the scripture with depth, it occurred to me that that verse occurs at the conclusion of 3 years of ministry where Jesus had met all kinds of sorrow and all kinds of people. And what it said to me was that Jesus never became clinically detached from people. He never became remote. He never said, well, just another day on the job. Got to heal somebody today. But he remained sensitive, marvelously sensitive. May we have that same passion in our lives. I was fascinated recently. I came across a statement by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who made a comparison between a small disaster at home and a large disaster abroad. He said, a small disaster at home is something like when I take a hammer and hit my thumb accidentally, and it is very painful, and I'm very cognizant of it. And a large disaster is when something happens to a lot of people far away. But in terms of the pain, probably I feel more pain for the small disaster, personally, existentially, than the large disaster. And several years ago, I was at the National Prayer Breakfast and heard a Presbyterian layman by the name of Ward Brem talk about this. And he was a lawyer, and his pastor had finally coaxed him into going on a missions trip. And he really didn't want to go, but finally he reluctantly caved to the pastor's pressure. Said he was in a hut in Africa in one of those first evenings, and when he woke up in the morning, looking through the doorway of his thatched hut was a little 6-year-old boy eyeing the power bars that Ward Brem had brought with him in the event that he got hungry from eating African food. He wanted his power bars. And Ward Brem said, I wonder what he'll do if he thinks I'm asleep. Will he do what boys all across the world would do? Try to grab one of these? So he said, I closed my eyes and faked like I was sleeping, and after a while I heard him stealthily creep into the room and grab a power bar and run out. And he said, I thought to myself, well, kids are the same all over the world. I thought that, he said, until I went outside, I got dressed, I went outside, and there at the doorway to my hut was this same little 6-year-old boy cradling his 18-month-old sister with a distended stomach who was dying of famine, and he was taking the power bar and one morsel at a time was breaking it and putting it in the child's mouth. He said at that moment in time, hunger became no longer a large disaster far away. It became personal, and I must do something about it. If something remains far away, we do not touch it. I cannot do everything, but I must do something. A key, and we've talked about this in this conference, a key in all of our churches is that we find a need, that something impresses upon our heart, that we don't do business as usual, that we don't do church as usual, but that there's a passion that grips us. There is suffering, there is need all around us, and God has put us here not to maintain organization, not to maintain structure, not just to build buildings and have nice programs. He's put us here to serve people with the same passion with which Jesus came to seek and to save and to minister. Fourth, Paul talks about courage. Although I was severely tested, he says. It takes courage to move forward in ministry. I love the experience of Paul at the ancient city of Lystra on the first missionary journey, where after the Lord used him to heal a man which had been lame from birth, practically the next day he's taken outside the city and he is pelted with rocks and left for dead. I mean, the miraculous power of God comes on him in one moment, and the next moment he's as vulnerable as all get out. Why doesn't the Lord supernaturally turn the rocks to marshmallows? Why doesn't he create a plastic glass shield around Paul so that they had a great mirror. That would stun people. They throw rocks and suddenly there's a plastic shield there. We've never seen plastic before. What is this? The amazing thing about Paul is after he got up, he went back into the city. And after he finished his route on that first missionary journey, he re-entered every city where he'd been tossed out of. Courage. If there is a choice between doing what is expedient and doing what is right, always do what is right. If this job were easy, God would have called somebody else to do it. But he's called you. When I was pastoring, I was determined to not build a church based upon guilt, to try to manipulate people to do something they didn't want to do by making them feel guilty if they didn't do it. So at one season, as we were in a growth spurt, it became very obvious we needed a lot more people in the system of volunteers than we were getting. And there are always two excuses. I don't have the time or I don't have the ability. And those are valid, maybe, sometime. And so I asked a person to do something. They said, Pastor, I would love to do that, but, and gave me the reason why they couldn't. And I looked at them and I said, I am so glad to hear you say that. And they looked at me like, what trap did we just walk into? And I said, well, you just admitted, and it was either the time or the lack of ability. I said, you just admitted that on your own you cannot do this. If you had said to me, yes, I can do this, if you'd have said that right away, I know that you would not have even had to pray about doing this because you admitted you could do it. You just have the ability to do it, or you have the time to do it. But you just articulated you can't do it, which is the fundamental qualification for the position I'm asking you to fill, because you are going to have the power of the Spirit. He's going to have to work on your schedule. He's going to have to give you the ability. We'll train you, but it's His work, and He's calling you to step outside the comfort zone and depend upon Him. Have some courage. And then the fifth thing that Paul says is that he was obedient. I've not hesitated to preach anything that would be helpful to you, and I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven. You know, sometimes being obedient is not doing something great, it's just doing something small. After Jesus is assured that Peter loves him, Jesus calls him to be courageous. Twice in John 21, he says, follow me. After letting Peter know that another is going to dress him and bind him and lead him where he doesn't want to go, Jesus says, follow me. And then when Peter asks about John's destiny, Jesus answers again, what is that to you? You, emphatic personal pronoun, you follow me. There is a separation and loneliness at times in God's call to service. Ian Mackenzie says there are times when it doesn't seem to make sense that God called us. We may feel overwhelmed and unable to carry on. Let someone else do this, we say. I've had enough. I don't have the strength, the ability, the stamina to do this. Jesus says, you follow me. Thereby he warns us not to follow our feelings or our fears, our shortcomings, our failures, our difficult circumstances. When all the props are removed, we are still following the one who is the answer to all of our prayers, the one who helps, strengthens, and supports us at every level as no one else can. A couple set sail just as the War of 1812 with Britain was looming. The couple was Adoniram and Ann Jetson. After a brief stay in India, they traveled to Burma, arriving in 1813. They were both 24 years of age when they left America. In Burma, no one knew the English language, and the Jetsons learned the language on their own. In those early years, they experienced the heartbreaking loss of two children. In 1822, Ann's health broke, and she returned to the United States for a rest, publishing a book on their pioneering missionary work in Burma. Upon her return in 1824, Adoniram was imprisoned and tortured. Anne followed her husband from prison to prison and preserved his and several other lives by bribing officials and providing food. In 1826, after 2 years of imprisonment, Adoniram was released, but in October of that same year, Anne died at the age of 38, worn out with hardships. I came across the letter that Adoniram wrote to Anne's father when he had requested her hand in marriage. I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world, whether you can consent to see her departure to a heathen land and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of a missionary life, whether you can consent to her exposures to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate of India, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death? Can you consent to all this for the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God? Can you consent to all this in hope of soon meeting your daughter in the world of glory with a crown of righteousness brightened by the acclamations of praise, which shall redound to her Savior from heathen saved through her means from eternal woe and despair? It took courage to be honest. It took courage for the father to let his daughter go. It took courage for the Jetsons to, in significant ways, lay down their life for the gospel. Statistics are not exactly clear, but it appears that by the time Adoniram Jetson died at the age of 62, he had somewhere between a dozen and 25 converts in the whole of Burma. But he had completed his most central mission, the translation of the Bible, which stands to this day, a Bible which over 2 million believers in Burma still use. In succession, the 3 women Jetson married in sequence all died before him, and he lost his life at sea. His one surviving son, Edward, speaking at the dedication of Judson Memorial Church in New York City, summarized his father's story this way, quote, "Suffering and success go together. If you are succeeding without suffering, it is because others before you have suffered. If you are suffering without succeeding, it is that others after you may succeed." Adoniram Jetson wrote these powerful 4 lines. In spite of sorrow, loss, and pain, our course will be onward still. We sow on Burma's barren plain. We reap on Zion's hill. These 5 words, integrity, humility, passion, courage, and obedience, can also be summed up in one word, character, who you are. These are the strains, these are the chords which determine the personality that we all are. A writer by the name of William Davis put it, the difference between reputation and character. Reputation is what you are supposed to be. Character is what you are. Reputation comes over you from outside. Character grows up from within. Reputation is made in a moment. Character is built in a lifetime. Reputation grows like a mushroom. Character grows like the rock. A single newspaper report gives you your reputation. A life of toil gives you your character. Reputation is what you have when you come to a new community. Character is what you have when you go away. Reputation makes you rich or makes you poor. Character makes you happy or makes you miserable. Reputation is what men say about you on your tombstone. Character is what angels say about you before the throne of God. So remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. God bless you.